Okay, so let's start up. I'm Patrick. I'm also from Status. I'm going to talk a little bit about building UX at Status. This is a very pithy title, an early retrospective. I actually really don't know what that means. More or less, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the UX team has thought about the way in which we construct our user experience, moving into our beta launch and putting things onto mainnet, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But first and foremost, just to get people on the same page about what Status is, I'm sure most people in this room are familiar, but one catchy way of thinking about it is a platform for value exchange, where our goals, I think, kind of span what we think about as like three channels or three pillars. One, we're trying to allow people or enable people in the decentralized world to communicate, to transact, to find and discover, commerce type applications where they can exchange goods with one another, and store their assets fundamentally. So to enable those transactions, of course, people have to have crypto, obviously, and to be able to store it somewhere safely and securely. Sorry. So this is what this kind of looks like when we think about these pillars or these principles of allowing people to either to transact or to communicate or to actually store the value of their goods. These are kind of like the three main sort of like use cases or flows that you can go through into the application. Julian, of course, talked about a little bit about dApps. Over there on the left-hand side, this is basically our entry point into the dApp screen. And so basically what I'm going to try and relay to you is a few different points that we've learned from user research over the last 6 months of doing a lot of iteration. I think we've gone through 9 rounds of usability studies. I do want to emphasize that we haven't learned and we haven't necessarily iterated just on usability studies by itself. This is an entire process that has taken our entire team, or when I say team, I mean the whole product development team. One of I think the best ways to learn about where people are stumbling with our application, where they're actually having usability problems, where we know we see drop-off maybe in usage, was actually from this experience of just pushing the app onto mainnet and going from alpha to beta. There's really no other better way we can actually learn something without having people actually use and try and transact on a regular basis, or just do things with the app on a regular basis. So let me jump in though. So the way that I'm going to structure this is basically I'm going to talk about an insight of something that we learned from doing user research, kind of translate that into plain language and how it has an effect on the UI. So in this first example, ignore the number, it's just sort of our tagging system, but basically this insight came, I think, early on when we were very worried about people coming into the app and knowing what to do with the seed phrase. So of course, this is your mnemonic that a user has to, they have to look at it, they have to understand, they have to comprehend what they're looking at and what it actually needs to be used for. And basically, as it says, in spite of going through a lot of iterations of making a stronger process for experiencing a good way to back up your seed phrase or to encounter the seed phrase and know that you have to back up, we found that people still just basically stopped at this step. And they stopped for a couple different reasons, but really the point is that we saw in different studies that they stopped and they might even have dropped off. And we're just basically confused about what they're doing. So to translate that into kind of like a product level question that we could ask ourselves as designers or as product managers or engineers, we can say, well, do people need to back up their seed phrases as a first step? This is like a common pattern that's sort of developing, we think, in a lot of different applications where it seems like it should be obvious that this is the first thing you do, because if you lose the seed phrase, you're screwed, you're out of luck, right? And we wanted to question this. One of the ways that I think one of the conversations that came out of this question is, well, if a user doesn't have assets in their wallet to begin with, and maybe they're just playing around with the app to begin with, we don't need to pressure them into to backing up their seed phrase at the first step. Maybe this is something that we can push to a different step. So how that has manifested most recently in our push on to mainnet is basically, we said, hey, let's try and find points or triggers within the application where it's actually contextual and it's appropriate that people might back up their seed phrase. So for example, we moved it onto the profile screen, which is one of the lesser used screens maybe, but it seems like it's an appropriate place. It's contextual with the other types of actions that you might do, like switching your currency or setting your notification preferences. It's basically a preference, or you could think of it that way. Another way to do it, or another way to think about it is, if we do detect, or if you do think that people are storing assets, maybe that's the appropriate time to tell them, hey, this is probably a good point to back up your seed phrase because you actually have value in your wallet, and you want to make sure that you don't lose it. The next insight is also related to what we call the signing phrase and the seed phrase. And then basically this is kind of, and again, a language interpretation issue that we see with people where they're just basically confusing the two. And what we mean by signing phrase, if you're not familiar, is basically a phishing guard. So at transaction steps, when people are paying for things or they want to sign for something, so to speak, we want to make sure that the screen that they're on is not being phished by an attacker. And so therefore, we feel like we need to have this step that protects people from phishing. Or initially, we wanted to kind of instantiate that as words. So basically 3 sort of safe words that people also had to write down. The problem with that is basically that you're asking on top of the seed phrase, which is 12 words, an additional 3 words for them to write down. And then you have to, to kind of convey to people what the difference is between the 2 of them. So we asked ourselves, can we use a better language for actions that maps to a user goal? And it's not actually just with the signing phrase that we're going through this and the seed phrase. It's a lot of actually terminology that we found that has been introduced to our application, but we see it in other applications as well. It's something we recognize that other designers in the space are kind of struggling with at this point. So we have examples like seed phrase versus recovery phrases we talked about, but we've also seen confusion around the concept of a contact code versus what your public key is. So different applications call this different things. But this is basically a way in which one user can share their contact or at least get in touch or connect with another user. There's things like recovering access and recovering your account or restoring your wallet, which is actually a different thing from restoring your account in our case. Receiving a transaction and requesting a transaction. So, requesting a transaction is maybe something I think in the old Web 2.0 world is something that, you might have, that's something you might have done face-to-face or over a different channel. It's not necessarily something that we see that people are kind of accustomed to doing in chat. So this also led to a different question about, can we, in the signing phrase case, just brainstorming about how we can maybe replace the text content with something that is a little bit easier for people to recall. And so rather than focusing on recognition and asking people to memorize things, all we wanted to do was kind of remove a layer of complexity and see if people could actually recall that they might have emojis, which is a very fancy way of saying, we just wanted to try out emojis. So this is something that we've implemented and are experimenting with. So what we like to do is basically have emojis on the signing phrase, and here you do enter your password, but we seem to see a little bit better uptake in terms of comprehension, or at least like a little bit more of an understanding of what this thing is supposed to do for you. Another insight is that we had this issue of how we were gonna protect and secure user data that was coming through, like for people that were coming into the onboarding flow in our application, and giving consent. So at a certain point, we were tracking user metrics for people that are on status, and like many different applications, they had to actually opt into us tracking the analytics on them, and we were basically using an old pattern. Which is basically the standard iOS and Android pattern for opting into metrics and tweaking the text to see if people would actually read it. They weren't really. So we asked ourselves, how can we make an opt-in for opt-in for metrics of tracking, or like a conscious and considered decision for users? And initially, this is actually, I can say initially, I'll tell you more in a minute, but this is what we came up with, where we removed this sort of ANSI pattern around stacking sharing your usage call to action. and placing them next to each other in a different version, where you kind of, as a user, you have to like see what people are asking you, or what status is asking you to do, then share or elect to share or not share data. And we flip them. We flip the sort of the sharing or the confirmation of sharing onto the left side versus the right side. And then we ask the people again about whether or not they're really sure they want to share their data. However, this conversation continued into the middle of the summer, whereby I think there's different folks within Status that said, oh, hey, like, why do we need to have tracking at all? Can we find different outlets or different ways in which we can, we can give up like a little bit of knowledge about how people are moving around in the application or using the application to guarantee there's like a little bit more security and privacy. So we have actually removed this altogether now, and it's actually not in our onboarding screen, and we're trying to figure out ways of getting at kind of regular active usage data through different channels. So the last insight I'll talk about is that also we were seeing that people, when it comes to sort of translating how crypto is sort of like, it kind of can be used for some of these transactions, these applications, we're getting confused about, okay, like when I send Ether or I send SNT to a different wallet, like actually how much, like what is the actual value that I'm sending? So yeah, so these are a couple different UX, UX sort of insights and practices that we've come away with. We're happy to answer any questions about them. Yeah, please come up afterwards.